I did
Sure.
bring up the Georgist school a couple times today. And
Oh, oh,
I know it's somewhat obscure, but I'm interested in it because they seem to make a good argument about the nature of nature,
yeah,
of
yeah,
the
okay,
natural world and what
yeah,
gives individuals the rights over it. And they make a clear distinction, which I appreciate. When they talk about the land value tax, tax your
yeah.
use of natural resources of what no man created and that every man should have an equal claim to, and don't tax the productive activity that takes place on that land. When you look at like the Native Americans, for example, and the colonization of North America,
Mhm.
it seems as though the state really was what kind of came in and established this system of property rights that gave people land deeds and land titles and made things that weren't owned by anyone then owned by individuals. So, I mean, isn't it really the state who has established these things? Aren't they unjustified? And why would something like a land value tax or paying a rent or fee for using nature, why is that not legitimate?
Well, a few things to be said about that. To begin with, the reason why, by the way, there were no the famines that plagued Maoist China are gone. Is that the work is that the farmers did indeed press for private property rights in land. If you're going to till the land, if you have the incentive to produce something on that land. If your land can be taken from you, then and the Soviet Union even had that a bit. They allowed people to private property rights in some of the land. And so it's a very productive way to eat. Otherwise, you'd have starvation. That's how farmers have incentives. If they can own the land, they enhance the land. They become stewards of the land because they own it. So I'm sure that you recognize that in the consequentialist sense, why it's a good thing. Beyond that, the ways in which the ownership of land originates often does indeed have to do with land grabs and seizures and all the rest of that, which we don't necessarily regard as just. But over time, those who seize land who can't operate it will sell to people who can. And so there will be a tendency over time, a very pronounced tendency, for the land to be owned and run by people who can operate it productively, since they're the ones who will have the wherewithal to buy it and run it, and they will be strengthened. So the system tends to even out in the end, quite apart from the origins of how land was taken. Now, in the case of the Georgists, they seem to be hung up. I mean, as you were saying, if you improve the land, you won't be taxed. But then we want to separate out the fact that you own the land and you should pay the tax and nobody else can. That you don't really have any right to the natural endowment of the land. You only have a right to the improvements you put upon that land. And that's possible. That distinction is possible. And then we're supposed to believe that the only people who should pay taxes then are landowners. But because, again, I'm saying that ownership of land is obviously very, very essential to motivating farmers to grow food and to improve land. So the Georgists don't object to ownership of land. They object to the fact that landowners don't bear the main burden of all taxes. I
Right. I
think
guess,
that's
I
their
mean,
view.
even if they
Yeah,
were to
but
concede that point, I think
yeah.
it's that just philosophically, because, I mean, what gives a person the right to draw a line around a piece of property, say, this is mine, no one else is allowed to come here, and if they do, I'll shoot them?
What I try to address that in this sense. The ownership of land often happens through the Lockean sense of mixing your labor with the soil, of tilling the land, and if it's unclaimed land, then you do that. Now, but I hasten to agree, however, with those who say, but that's often a fairy tale. It's not the way it happens. So somebody grabs the land. All I'm suggesting to you is that it's very difficult, sometimes possible, to make restitution for legal seizure of land. I was arguing that about the Palestinians having been driven from their land by the Zionists. So that's possible. But if you're saying then that there's something arbitrary about the way land is originally seized, I'm going to agree that oftentimes that is the case. Oftentimes land has been seized, and oftentimes there's been it's unjust. But by and large, what happens over time, unless government continues to intervene on behalf of the feudal landowners, is that those who can most productively operate the land tend to dominate, tend to buy up the land. And so the land tends to be in the hands of people who can operate it most productively. Somebody who seized it, who can't operate it, will sell out to somebody who can. So if you look certainly at lands, I mean, there are other ways land is allocated. All I'm saying is that we're confusing origins with the way things operate today. By and large, if you look at the U.S., land, apart from the land that the government owns, by the way, that it simply owns by fiat, by and large, the land is owned, and by and large, in other countries, and as indeed to the extent that land was according to the farmers, it's owned by people who can operate it. So I don't think that we have to get too hung up on the fact that land ownership originates potentially in seizure, and the fact that over time it tends to fall into the hands of those who can make the most money from it and can operate it most productively. But the nub of the Georgist point of view seems to be that land and resources tend to be God-given and or tend to be in nature, and why should the landowner profit in any way from that land? My problem with that is, isn't it also true that human capacity is God-given? We know that people are born. We can make the same kind of distinction with land that we can with labor that we can with land. We can talk about how, well, by the time you're 10 or 15 years old, you have all kinds of innate talents and abilities, but you don't deserve credit for those innate talents or abilities. Those are in your nature. Those are naturally given to you. And so then we can make the same distinction and say that's the same thing as the land that's sort of naturally given. And then, as you were just saying, well, the Georgists will say, well, to the extent that you develop the land, that we won't tax you for. Well, to the extent that you develop your own talents and capacities, we won't tax you for that. However, we all know that people who excel, we all know that great athletes, all the rest of them, much of their success is due to the fact that they have endowments that they don't deserve any credit for. So why not tax them in the same way, with the same kind of logic that can be applied to land? So that's the reason why I don't see that there's any great distinction between, in the Georgist argument, between labor and land, and between an income tax and a land tax. Because from my viewpoint, we really could have a minarchist night watchman state, and taxes wouldn't be much of an issue anyway. But getting back to your point about the arbitrary division of land, again, my argument is that if you look at most market economies, the land tends to be in the hands of people who can operate it productively, however the land originated in the past. And so usually it's not a problem. But I would agree with you, by the way, if there really was forcible seizure of land, and you can say, well, my ancestors were uprooted, the land, they were mixing their labor with the soil, the land was taken from them, then I think that those property rights can be respected and restitution can be made. So while I'm not saying that it's an easy topic, I think that by and large, most of the problems that you raise can be resolved. And again, the Georgists, as I think, are too hung up on the natural endowments in land that landowners don't take any credit for, versus the same argument that can be applied to the natural endowments of human beings that they can't take any credit for either. So the same kind of Georgist argument can be applied to justify an income tax just as much as can be applied to justifying a land tax.